In this video, we're going to talk about biology, or the study of life, and what makes something alive, what isn't alive. We'll talk about some of the gray areas that exist between the living and the non-living. So biology is the scientific study of life. Now, there are 7 characteristics that all living things have. There are gray areas between things that we consider alive and things that we don't consider alive. And these gray areas may have some of the 7 characteristics, but not all 7. So all living things have these 7 characteristics. So first we have order, which is the highly ordered structure that typifies life. We're not, we're not made of forms that are just always falling apart like piles of sand, right? We have defined structures that are maintained over time. Compartments, compartments for digestion, for respiration, things like that. Reproduction, the ability of an organism to produce their own kind. If you couldn't reproduce, if there was ever a living thing that couldn't reproduce, we wouldn't know about that species, right? Because it wouldn't last very long. Growth and development, all living things grow and they also change as they grow, which is what we call development. So consistent growth and development controlled by inherited DNA from parents. Energy processing, all living things use chemical energy or energy that they gather. Well, usually it's, many different kinds of energy can be gathered from the environment, but it's all converted into chemical energy that powers an organism's activities and chemical reactions. Regulation, an ability to control an organism's internal environment within limits that sustain life. So there are certain conditions that are conducive to life that have to be maintained. The external environment is always changing. It's becoming too salty. It's becoming not salty enough. It's becoming too acidic or too basic. Temperatures are always changing, too dry, too wet even for certain organisms. And so there has to be every organism has to have some ability to regulate its internal environment and keep an internal environment that's conducive to life. Response to the environment and ability to respond to environmental stimuli. All living things can do this, right? Can sense things in their environment and respond to them, even plants. And evolutionary adaptation. So the environment is always changing. And to survive in a particular environment, you have to be adapted to it, but then that environment inevitably will change over time. So at that time, a species will either go extinct when it no longer matches its environment, or it will evolve to match the new environment. Okay? So adaptations evolve not all at once. It takes a long time, many generations, as individuals with traits that are best suited to their environment have greater reproductive success, and so they pass on their traits to the next generation. Individuals that are not well suited to the new environment, as the environment changes, they're not going to survive as well. They're not going to pass on their genes as well. And so their genes will be weeded out of future generations. But it happens slowly over time. We'll go over these 7 characteristics of life in a little bit more detail. I want to explain order in particular a little bit more, because order matters because there's this constant battle against entropy that we will talk about constantly throughout the term. So entropy, this is a physics term. It pertains to one of the laws of thermodynamics that states that entropy is always increasing in the universe. Entropy is a tendency towards disorder. So it's a measure of disorder. Okay, so entropy is a measure of how disorderly a system is. And entropy is always increasing in the universe. So all things in the universe naturally move towards a state of less order. Right, more randomness, or another way of thinking about it is more random distribution, more even distribution spread out over a wider space. I like to think of organisms as the Langoliers, Stephen King's Langoliers. Do you know, if any of you know of Stephen King's Langoliers, the Langoliers eat up reality. They at the end of each day. So at the end of each day, all humans move into the next day, and the previous day, the reality is eaten up by the Langoliers. And I like to think of us, not just humans, but all living things as Langoliers, because we and all living things eat order. We leave disorder behind us. We may have an orderly system, but it is costly in terms of universal entropy. We seem to be order in a universe of increasing chaos, and that seems to mean it seems to be like we fly in the face of the laws of thermodynamics. We fly in the face of this, being alive flies in the face of this rule that things tend towards disorder because we have these very organized bodies that we're able to build. But it's not actually a violation of that law because in reality, our presence, the fact of being alive, causes entropy to increase faster than it would without our presence, because we have to eat things. We have to harvest energy. And by eating things, we disorder those things. We take hamburgers and turn them into feces and carbon dioxide, right? And so we pay for this order by increasing disorder elsewhere faster than it would have occurred on its own. So entropy is a measure of disorder. More entropy equals more disorder. Everything moves naturally towards a state of disorder or randomness, and only by investing energy can this trend be reversed. Energy, so you have to invest energy to create an orderly body, but that energy is harvested by increasing entropy elsewhere. A reduction in entropy in one place, or the creating order in one place, is paid for by increasing entropy elsewhere. So here's some, familiar themes where you might notice entropy, some familiar places where you can find entropy. So you have this room, right, your bedroom, and it starts out nice and tidy and organized, and disorder happens spontaneously without any special effort on your part. The room will become disorganized. So when it's orderly, you have compartments to find specific things. So you have shirts in a shirt drawer, and pants in a pants drawer, and socks in a socks drawer, and change in a change jar, and pens in the pen jar, and paper in the paper drawer, right? So there's compartments where you know where you can find certain things, and you don't find those things in other places. You don't find socks on the desk, right? But then over time, things start to get randomly spread out through the room. And so you end up having this messy room, and you have to organize it by investing your energy and your time to reverse that trend. And you get energy for doing that by eating your breakfast, right? Another place you might see this is on your school desk. So you have like a desk, if you have a desk at school or in an office somewhere, it inevitably gets chaotic and messy and disorganized over time. And then, like before I make these videos, I always organize the room behind me so it doesn't look like the mess that I normally live in, right? And that takes time and energy to do. But you find entropy in all places, not just in a bedroom or a desk. For example, if you drop a little bit of food coloring into a glass of water, at first that dye will be orderly. You can find it all in one place and not in the other parts of the glass. So that's orderly. But then without even mixing it, even if you didn't mix it, even if you just left it there and you came back later to look at it, eventually that dye would spread out naturally and fairly evenly, it would become fairly evenly distributed throughout the glass. So this is diffusion. Diffusion is just what happened. It's when molecules, in this case, the food coloring molecules, move from areas where they're highly concentrated, like in the initial droplet, outwards towards areas where they are less concentrated. So we say that that's moving down their concentration gradient from areas of high to low concentration. So at the beginning, the dye molecules are tidy, they're organized, they're concentrated or compartmentalized. They're all in a single location. And then they become less orderly, untidy, disorganized. And this is through this happens through random movement of molecules. It happens naturally until some sort of equilibrium is reached. And you have approximately the same amount of food coloring molecules in the top part of the glass as you have in the bottom part of the glass. And this is the same thing that happens with smell. So if you're baking in an oven, like baking pie in an oven, the scent of the apple pie that you're baking, it starts out all concentrated in the oven, but as those scent molecules fill the oven. They start to naturally diffuse outwards into the rest of the house, so that eventually you can smell those apple pie aroma molecules from all parts of the house, because they're moving from where they're highly concentrated in the oven outwards to become more randomly distributed. If they were going to be tidy, they would stay in the oven, but they're going to move outwards to a greater state of randomness, so that you can't predict where they will be because they're randomly distributed everywhere. So how does this affect living things? Well, all living things are made out of cells, and a cell has to keep an orderly, tidy structure. It has to regulate its internal environment. It has to be separate from its external environment, because when we die, right, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, when we die, we become one with our surroundings. But while we are alive, we are separate from our surroundings. There is outside and there is inside, and what's happening inside is conducive to life, and it maintains life, right? Separate from the external environment. So here in this picture on the left, we have a plasma membrane, a cell membrane, and it's separating the inside of the cell on one side from the outside of the cell on the other side. And you'll see that there is here some molecule that the cell either wants to sequester. I don't know which side. It doesn't really matter which side is in and which is out, right? Perhaps this is a sugar molecule. Perhaps the top is inside the cell. And there's the sugar molecule that the cell wants to concentrate inside, because it's an energy source. So there's not very much sugar on the outside, and it's collecting every sugar it encounters on the inside. That's order. That's a loss of entropy, a low entropy situation. But here, if you didn't have the cell membrane, right? If there was no cell membrane, the sugars would just be randomly distributed in solution. They would just be spread out like the food coloring molecules in the glass after they've sat for a while. So cells expend energy to combat entropy, to combat disorder. So that's order. That's the most complicated part, I think, of that list of the 7 characteristics of life. So order is required for life. Little compartments. Living things have little compartments that collect all the nutrients and other elements that are essential for building life. And they have little organized areas devoted to certain tasks. They build an internal environment that's separate from their external environment. All right, let's move on to regulation. So related to this concept of order is the maintenance or regulation of the internal environment to maintain conditions that are conducive to life. So for life to persist, the organism cannot get too dry, or the chemical reactions that keep the organism alive will just stop. All these molecules that keep us alive that are reacting, creating bigger molecules, breaking down to extract energy, all of these important chemical reactions that keep us alive can only happen when all the molecules are floating around in water. So if we get too dry, all those chemical reactions will stop, will pause. Also, living things can't get too wet, or the cells might burst. They can't get too hot, or the enzymes that keep the organism alive might stop working. They might break down. If an organism gets too cold, it could freeze, and chemical reactions that keep it alive will stop. Many living things need to remove, or all living things need to remove waste products or toxins that could disrupt their biological activities, that disrupt their function, to fuel their activities, one of which is combating entropy and maintaining order. The living thing will need to retain a certain amount of molecules that provide it with energy, right? Like sugars, oxygen, fats. So regulating the quantity of acids, waste, nutrients, water, salt, all of those things need to be regulated to some degree or another for the living thing to stay alive. Energy processing. Okay, so all organisms must get energy somehow. Some might eat other organisms, like this caterpillar eating a leaf. Some get their energy from the sun, like this leaf. This leaf harnesses the energy and light and turns it into sugars. So why do organisms need energy? Well, to fight entropy, like we talked about, to regulate their internal environment, to reproduce, actually just to do anything, to do any of the things in this list, the organism will need energy. So harvesting energy from the environment and processing it so that that energy is usable to the living thing, that's an essential aspect of being alive. Fight entropy, maintain homeostasis or regulate the internal environment, reproduce, evade threats, acquire molecules to build cells, among other things. If ever an organism came into being that could not reproduce, we wouldn't know about it today, would we? For a species to have a noticeable presence on the planet, it must have the ability to reproduce. So that, reproduction is how a species expands across space and through time. So all living things reproduce. They may reproduce in their own unique fashion, but they all reproduce. Growth and development. All living things, even single cells, have different stages of their life cycles devoted to different activities. One stage might be for growing bigger by acquiring a lot of energy. Another stage might be for reproduction. The organism might take different forms during these different stages. We call this maturation and development. This also requires energy, of course. Respond to the environment. So for an organism to survive, and especially for a species as a whole to survive, the individuals need to be able to sense their environment and respond to the environment. So why might an organism need to be able to sense things in the environment and respond? Well, predators, right? That's one obvious thing. Finding food, that's another thing. Even single-celled organisms respond to chemical changes around them, moving towards favorable conditions and away from unfavorable conditions so that they can move towards nutrients and away from toxins so that they can live long enough to reproduce. Plants, they grow their roots towards water sources and nutrient sources. They move their branches towards the light. And so the direction of that their growth takes will change depending upon whether they're shaded and they need to, grow around another tree or something like that. So all living things are able to sense the things in their environment and respond to them. Evolutionary adaptation. So like I said, the environment is always changing. The Earth is not today the way it was at its beginning. We go through ice ages and hot ages. There are local changes like natural disasters, floods, new species, new predators and competitors come in. Food sources might go extinct. So the environment today is not what it will always be. The Earth is not stagnant. It is always changing. It's dynamic. And yet, the species alive today are impressively well suited to their current environment, their environment as it exists right now, despite the fact that these environments are not what they once were, and they've changed, and they will continue to change. So take the snowy owl, for example. Its feathers are designed and distributed to be effective insulation in the sub-zero temperatures it inhabits. Its color is perfect camouflage in its snowy habitat. Its vision and hearing and talons are all perfectly designed to catch the prey that sustains it in the Arctic tundra. Yet its ancestors did not always live in an Arctic tundra. They did not always live in the exact same conditions in which the owl currently lives today. It did not always have the same food sources it has today. And if those ancestors had all these same features, they would have been poorly suited to the environments in which they lived. Let's take another example. Look at these seahorses. These seahorses are living on coral, and they look exactly like the coral that they live upon. You can't tell them apart from that coral. So they are adapted perfectly to this very specific environment, an environment that did not always exist. These animals would have been poorly suited to any prior environment if they looked like this. But their ancestors didn't look like this. Their ancestors were well adapted to their environment that they lived in. And when conditions changed, the species evolved. So as the environment changes, only offspring that have traits that are well suited to the new conditions will survive and breed and pass their genes to their offspring, right? And so over time, over the generations, very slowly, the genes that are a poor fit for the local environment will not get passed on as often, and so will start to disappear. And the genes that are best suited to the current environment will get passed on more often, and so the new generations will become an ever better fit for the current environmental conditions, right? And sometimes the environment changes slowly. Usually we very slowly move from an ice age to a warm age and back again, but sometimes there are spikes. And if a species, a local species, doesn't have traits that allow it to survive under the new conditions, if the forest gets burned down, if a volcano erupts and covers the land with lava, and now there's a completely new environment in its wake. If the species doesn't have any traits that allow it to survive, it will go extinct. If a few individuals have useful traits for survival, they will reproduce, and they will pass those useful traits to their offspring, and the next generation will look a bit more like them. So when an environment changes, whether it be slow or fast, species that don't have traits that allow them to survive the new environment go extinct. Species where some individuals have useful traits will adapt. Okay? The useful traits will proliferate, the less useful traits will be weeded out, and the species will gradually change over time, and that's evolution. Now that we've talked about the 7 characteristics that define life, I want to talk about different levels of biological organization. So the most basic level of organization is the atom. And coming up next week, we'll be talking about atoms and chemistry, how different atoms interact with each other to build molecules. So all living things are built out of atoms that are arranged in a variety of different patterns to create a variety of different molecules like DNA, sugars, fats, proteins, things like that. These are the molecules of life that build an organism. So the most basic level of organization is the atom. These arrange themselves into more complex structures like molecules, like DNA. Molecules, many different kinds of molecules come together to build organelles, or parts of a cell. Organelles all work together and put together create a cell. And in this diagram, you have a neuron. That's one type of cell, but there are many types. Cells, many different cell types come together to build a tissue type, like nervous tissue, for example. Many different tissues come together and organize to form a brain, or an organ, in this case, a brain. And then many different organs come together to form an organism. And many different, and that's really the end of biology right there. So the field of biology looks at the organism and down. An organism is like an individual living thing, an alligator, a person, a bird. That would be an organism. When you move upwards further on this hierarchy of organization, you have many different organisms can come together to create a population, like a population of alligators. And now we're moving into the field of ecology. So ecology is the study of how different living things interact with each other and how they interact with their abiotic or non-living environment. So many individuals come together to create a population, like a population of alligators. Many populations of many different species come together to form a community. So, for example, a wetland, all the organisms that live in a wetland ecosystem would be a community. That includes the plants and all the different species of animals. And then an ecosystem is the non-living and all the living components. So like the Florida Everglades, it has all the living things, the community, but also water, temperature, weather, right? Those are all the soils. So that would be an ecosystem. And the biosphere is all living things on the planet. Now, you don't need to memorize all these different levels of organization that are related to biology, but there are a couple of things I want to talk about when it comes to this hierarchy. One, I want you to note that as you move up in the hierarchy to more complex levels of organization, new properties emerge along the way. So, for example, molecules have properties that atoms themselves alone don't have. And cells, a living cell, has properties that Individual molecules on their own don't have. An organism, like you, a person, you have properties that if you took your organs apart and you had a brain and a heart and a stomach laying out on a table separately, those organs don't have the property of a person. So we call these emergent properties, properties that emerge at higher levels, more complex levels of organization that didn't exist at the level below them. Now, the property at which the level at which life emerges is the cell. The cell is the first place where we see all the characteristics of life, those 7 characteristics we were just talking about. They all come together at the cellular level. So the cell is where the properties of life emerge. Emergent properties are new properties that arise in each step upward in the hierarchy of life from the arrangement and interactions among component parts. So the smaller, the lower levels of organization, the simpler levels of organization arrange and organize in these complex ways that create new properties when they come together to form a more complex level of organization. Oops. Cells are the level at which the properties of life emerge. A cell can regulate its internal environment. It can take in and use energy. It's organized. I don't have that here. It can sense and respond to its environment. It can develop and maintain its complex organization. It can give rise to new cells, and it can evolve. Okay, so you see all these properties of life once you get to the cellular level. Below that, you may see some of the properties of life, but not all 7.